Picture a crowded bank hall in 1914. The marble floors are polished, the clerks are calm, and the promise is printed in confident ink. This paper note can be exchanged for a fixed amount of gold. For decades, that sentence acted like a spell. It turned fragile paper into something people treated as real wealth. Now imagine the spell being tested, not by one customer, but by thousands. Not because of a rumor, but because a continent is sliding into war. If money is a promise to pay gold on demand, what happens when everyone demands it at once, and the state needs every ounce to survive? In Episode 1, we traced how the modern money system was built. In Episode 2, we explored why money gradually became unbacked. Today, we zoom in on the hinge moment between those worlds, the collapse of the gold standard. Tonight's story is the story of an impossible promise. The gold standard didn't die because people stopped liking gold. It collapsed because modern economies, modern wars, and modern politics eventually demanded something the gold standard could not deliver: stability without surrender. Gold-backed money is older than central banks, older than nation-states in their modern form. But the gold standard as we remember it, the tight, rule-bound system of fixed convertibility, was largely a product of the late 19th century. By the 1870s, the world was industrializing fast. Railways stitched continents together. Telegraph cables collapsed distances. Trade volumes exploded. In that environment, merchants and governments needed a common language of value. Gold became that language. Britain, the era's dominant trading and financial power, had effectively anchored its currency to gold. London was the hub where bills of exchange were settled, shipping was insured, and capital was raised. As other countries joined the gold standard, Germany after unification, the United States more firmly by the turn of the century, gold became a kind of international constitution for money. There's a romantic myth that the gold standard was a purely technical choice, honest money versus political money. The reality is more human and more political. The classical gold standard worked best in a world where governments were smaller, voting rights were limited, labor markets were less organized, and recessions were considered painful but tolerable. In other words, it functioned in a world where the groups hurt by deflation, workers, farmers, debtors, had less political power than the groups protected by hard money, creditors, financiers, and the internationally connected commercial class. That balance began to shift in the early 20th century. Democracies expanded, labor movements gained strength, and the state's role grew, from basic governance into social insurance, mass education, and national security. Money, once a quiet measure of value, became a frontline instrument of policy. Then came the catastrophe that the gold standard was never designed to handle: total war. When World War I began in 1914, governments faced bills on a scale no tax system could immediately cover. War is an economic furnace. It demands steel, fuel, food, ships, uniforms, and wages right now. Under strict gold convertibility, you can't simply create enough money to mobilize an entire society. You either raise taxes drastically, borrow vast sums, or suspend the rules. Most chose suspension. Convertibility was paused, export of gold was restricted, and paper claims multiplied while gold stayed finite. The gold standard wasn't abolished in one dramatic vote. It was simply put aside, like a sacred rule that suddenly seemed less sacred than survival. After the war, many policymakers tried to bring it back. They wanted the old certainty, the old prestige, the old order. But the world they returned to was not the world they had left. To understand why the gold standard collapsed, we have to understand what it was actually doing, mechanically, inside an economy. At its core, a gold standard is a fixed promise. The central bank stands ready to convert currency into gold at a set price. Because the gold price is fixed, exchange rates between gold standard countries become fixed too. Money supply becomes tied, directly or indirectly, to gold reserves. This creates a powerful benefit: credibility. If people believe they can always swap paper for gold, they are less likely to panic. Long-term contracts become easier. International trade becomes smoother. Capital flows with less fear of sudden devaluation. But this credibility comes with a cost: constraint. Under a gold standard, the state gives up a key modern tool: monetary independence. When gold flows out of a country, the central bank must defend convertibility. In practice, That means making money scarcer, raising interest rates, tightening credit, and slowing the economy until imports fall and confidence returns. Economists often describe an automatic adjustment mechanism. If a country runs a trade deficit, gold leaves, the money supply contracts, prices fall, exports become cheaper, and balance is restored. This is the famous price, specie flow logic. But in real life, that automatic adjustment was never painless or truly automatic. It depended on people accepting wage cuts, on businesses surviving lower demand, and on politics tolerating unemployment. Here's the brutal translation. Defending gold parity often required recession. That's why the gold standard stability was, in many ways, a stability for exchange rates, not for jobs. And as economies modernized, another problem grew. Financial systems became more fragile and interconnected. Banks lent short-term and invested long-term. Depositors could run. Credit cycles intensified. In such a world, central banks increasingly needed to act as lenders of last resort, flooding the system with liquidity during panics. But a strict gold standard makes large, fast liquidity injections dangerous. If you create money during a panic, people might convert it to gold. Gold reserves drain. The peg breaks. So the central bank is forced to choose, save the banks or save the gold promise. This is where the gold standard runs into a fundamental policy conflict that still defines international finance today. It's often summarized as the impossible trinity. You can't have all three at the same time. Fixed exchange rates, free capital movement, independent monetary policy. The classical gold standard tried to have 1, and increasingly 2. That meant sacrificing 3. The price of a stable gold peg was the loss of domestic flexibility. For a while, elites accepted that price. But once societies began to demand full employment, social stability, and crisis management, that sacrifice became politically explosive. The first collapse, 1914, and the end of classical gold. World War I didn't just strain budgets, it rewired expectations. Citizens who were asked to fight and ration also demanded a greater say after the war. Governments learned that monetary and fiscal tools could mobilize resources at scale. And once you learn that, it's hard to unlearn. The second collapse, the interwar restoration that failed. In the 1920s, many countries attempted to restore gold convertibility. But they faced a choice. At what price? If you return to gold at the pre-war exchange rate, you are effectively declaring, we will push our domestic economy, wages, prices, and employment down until the old parity makes sense again. That is deflationary policy by design. The most famous case was Britain. When the UK returned to gold in 1925 at the pre-war parity, the pound was arguably overvalued relative to the country's post-war competitive position. An overvalued currency makes exports expensive and industry less competitive. The adjustment required falling prices and wages. That meant pressure on workers in industrial regions already under stress. This wasn't a technical footnote. It was a social conflict. By the late 1920s, the global system looked stable on paper, but it was brittle underneath. Capital was mobile, confidence was fragile, and gold reserves were unevenly distributed. Some countries ran surpluses and accumulated gold. Others bled reserves defending their pegs. Then the Great Depression arrived. When output collapses and banks fail, the gold rules become a trap. Countries that clung tightly to gold often responded by tightening money to protect reserves. Exactly the opposite of what collapsing economies needed. As panic spread, central banks and investors hoarded gold. That hoarding shrank the effective monetary base. Deflation deepened. Debt burdens rose in real terms. The political pressure became unbearable. The pattern was striking. Countries that left gold earlier generally recovered earlier. Britain abandoned the gold standard in 1931 after intense pressure and reserve losses. The United States, after its own banking crises, suspended domestic convertibility and redefined the gold price in 1933 to 1934. Other nations followed in waves. The gold standard didn't collapse because one villain pulled a lever. It collapsed because, in a depression, defending a fixed gold price meant defending unemployment, deflation, and banking collapse. Democracies chose a different priority. The third collapse, Bretton Woods, and the end of the gold exchange era. After World War II, policymakers tried again. this time with a compromise. The Bretton Woods system wasn't the old gold standard. It was a gold exchange standard. The US dollar was pegged to gold, and other currencies were pegged to the dollar. Only foreign central banks could convert dollars into US gold, not ordinary citizens. This created a new kind of stability. Exchange rates were fixed but adjustable. Capital controls were common. Governments had more room to manage domestic demand. For a couple of decades, it worked relatively well. But the compromise contained its own contradiction. The world needed dollars to trade and hold as reserves. That meant the United States needed to supply dollars to the world, often by running deficits. Yet the more dollars accumulated abroad, the more foreign central banks could, in principle, demand conversion into gold. U.S. gold reserves were finite. Global demand for dollar liquidity was not. This tension is often called the Triffin dilemma. The reserve currency country must provide liquidity, but doing so can undermine confidence in its gold convertibility. By the 1960s, the pressures intensified. The U.S. economy was large and productive, but it was also financing expensive commitments, Cold War defense spending, the Vietnam War, and ambitious domestic programs. Dollars flowed abroad. Gold flowed out. Some European policymakers worried that the U.S. was enjoying an exorbitant privilege, paying for global influence in its own currency. Others simply worried about the arithmetic. There were more dollar claims than there was gold to honor them at the official price. Attempts were made to defend the system. Coordinated gold sales, swap lines, new reserve assets like special drawing rights. But the underlying promise remained the same, a fixed gold price for the dollar. And by the early 1970s, that promise was increasingly not credible. In August 1971, the United States suspended the convertibility of dollars into gold for foreign official holders. The gold window was closed. It was framed as temporary, but the old system never truly returned. By 1973, major currencies moved toward floating exchange rates. This wasn't a sudden betrayal of a perfect system. It was a recognition that the system's math and politics no longer aligned. In a world of massive trade volumes, fast capital flows, and democratic expectations for growth and employment, tying the entire monetary base to a limited metal stock was like trying to run a modern power grid on candlelight. If the gold standard collapsed, why does gold still matter? Because gold never lost its psychological role. It is durable, scarce, and globally recognized. But after the 1970s, gold shifted from being the anchor of the system to being a mirror held up to the system, a hedge, a signal, a refuge. The collapse of gold convertibility changed three big things. 1. Money became explicitly political under gold. Monetary policy was often framed as obedience to an external rule. After gold, monetary policy became a matter of human judgment. Inflation targets, employment goals, financial stability mandates. That gave governments and central banks flexibility, but also responsibility. When mistakes happen, there is no metal to blame. 2. Financial crises could be fought differently without the gold constraint. Central banks gained the ability to expand balance sheets aggressively in crises, act as lender of last resort at scale, and stabilize banking systems. That toolset has prevented some collapses, but it has also raised new questions about moral hazard, inequality, and asset price cycles. 3. Global power shifted from metal to institutions in the gold era. Credibility was tied to reserves. In the fiat era, credibility is tied to institutions, tax capacity, legal stability, central bank reputation, and geopolitical strength. This is why reserve currencies are not just about economics. They are about trust in a state. And that brings us back to the modern world we live in now, a world where money is no longer a promise of metal, but a promise of governance. So why did the gold standard collapse? Because it asked societies to accept a trade, stable convertibility in exchange for domestic pain. In the 19th century, that trade was politically survivable. In the 20th century, under total war, mass democracy, modern banking, and global capital flows, it became untenable. Gold did not fail as a metal. The promise failed as a policy. And once that promise was gone, the most important question changed. It was no longer, how much gold backs this note? It became, why does anyone accept this note at all? In the next episode, we'll tackle the foundation of the modern system, where money's value truly comes from, if not from gold.